So we have students who leading this evening's event. They call themselves the Ecotarians. You can stand up, please. And my job is simply to introduce you to the Ecotarians. They'll tell you why they're called that, and they'll explain the purpose of this evening. Please.
Well, good evening everyone, and welcome to tonight's panel discussion. We are indeed the Ecotarians, and we'll tell you what that means in a second. But first of all, how do we grow from here towards sustainable food production? That's the title of our panel discussion tonight. And the aim of this event was really to bring together policymakers, experts in food and farming, journalists, NGOs, producers and distributors, as well as those of you interested in food and sustainability. Now, you may have recently attended another panel discussion which happened here in August, which spent a lot of time describing the negative environmental impacts of the whole food system. Here, our purpose is really to engage in an open debate on what sustainable food production means, what it looks like, and how we can achieve it while confronting the potential compromises and conflicts that may arise. But it's very encouraging to see a lot of you here, and the fact that this event is being filmed live as well is wonderful. Thank you all for coming, first of all. Now a little bit of background to the problem, for those of you unfamiliar. Currently, the way we grow, process and distribute food across the world is contributing to climate change, land and soil degradation, water shortages, and huge losses of biodiversity alongside public health crises like obesity, vitamin deficiency and antibiotic resistance. Now, food production depends on a wide range of environmental factors, from soil quality to local ecosystems, as well as weather and climate. Meanwhile, its impacts are also felt throughout the natural world, the atmosphere, the land, the water, and indeed ecosystems, including our own. So a few facts. First of all, agriculture makes up roughly 24% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So that's from indirect CO2 emissions, methane from livestock, and nitrous oxide from agrochemicals. In Europe, it takes on average 500 years for the formation of only 2.5 centimetres of soil. So in the European Union, about 12.7% of arable land, which is the entire surface area of Greece, is estimated to suffer from moderate to high erosion. Also, agriculture can be a resource-intensive process, of course. According to certain estimates, agriculture accounts for approximately a massive 70% of water consumption globally. Moreover, only 12 plant species provide 75% of our total food supply, and 15 mammal and bird species make up 90% of our livestock production. Clearly, something must change. So we hope that this debate will provide a valuable insight into what possible pathways there are to making food production sustainable, tackling these problems, and we'd also like to explore the relative responsibilities and the influence of government.
So I'm just going to say a few words about the Karp Institute and the Ecotarian. So as Martin Sigrid alluded to, so the Grantham Institute for Climate Change is the center of the diverse environmental research performed here at Imperial College London. The Institute contributes to credible and effective UK and international action on climate change. The idea and vision of this event came from us as the Ecotarian, and we are an initiative created by, we are PhD students from the Science and Solutions for a Changing Planet program. Our aim for the past year has been to spread the word about sustainable diets. You can explore our work on our website, provided on the leaflets in front of you. We produce an educational blog, so this blog, on all aspects of the food system. We provide seasonal and sustainable recipes, and we maintain an eco-foodie London map of sustainable restaurants and food-based schemes.
You might have also seen in front of you the cards. Based on what you heard this evening, we'd like to hear your ideas on how to achieve sustainable food production, based on what you hear from the panel this evening. And kind of who do you think are the most important actors that have a role to play in this system? So when you leave this evening and head into the reception hall, you'll see 4 boards outside. I invite you to put your card with your ideas on each on one of the boards that you think is most suitable. So these will cover citizens, so us as consumers, government, agro-industry and farming, and retailers. So this will just act as an interactive display and promote discussion, and we'll use these results to steer our future research on this topic. It's my pleasure to hand over to our panel chair, Louise Gray. She'll introduce the evening's speakers and keep on top of the discussion. She's worked as environment correspondent for the Daily Telegraph for 5 years, and has also worked for the BBC, The Guardian, The Sunday Times, Country Life, among other publications. She's also just released a book called The Ethical Carnivore, in which she describes the unenviable task of sourcing her own meat for a whole year, and just dives into the ethics of meat production and consumption. When you leave today, you'll also see some vouchers for this book, 30% off. So, without further ado, please take them.
Thanks a lot. Welcome, everyone. Thanks to my panelists who've already helped me out. It's great to see you all here. I've just, like was explained at the beginning, I've just written a book, The Ethical Carnivore, and it came really from coming to places like the Grantham Institute, being told by scientists that all the emissions from all the cars, planes, trains in the world don't equal the emissions from livestock. So the best thing we can do is eat less meat. I took it to the extreme and only ate animals I killed myself for a year to explore where meat comes from. But next, I want to find out how we can be more sustainable over fruits and vegetables and everything. So I'm really looking forward to some answers from this discussion. The title, How We Grow From Here Towards Sustainable Food Production. I just wanted to say what we mean by sustainable. I think it means food which is produced without damaging the environment, or at least passing it on in a better state than we found it to our children. We have some excellent panelists. I'm going to go from right to left. Andrew Clark is Director of Policy at the National Farmers Union. So I'm hoping to find out from him where food starts, how we can farm it more sustainably. And he did some research into the nomadic herding of buffalo in the Himalayas, in his part. Next, Angela Karp, Associate Director for Science Innovation at the Rothamsted Institute. And I'm hoping to find out from her how science and technology might help us to produce food more sustainably. And she did her research on willow trees. Next we have Steve Webster, an independent consultant on food production with a particular interest in animal welfare. So I'm hoping to find out from him how these more sustainable methods might translate into the food we get on supermarket shelves via big business. And he did a PhD on pig production, and at the time he was a vegetarian. And then lastly, we've got David Powell, the environment lead at the NEF, which is a new economic foundation, an quite innovative think tank. So I'm hoping from him that we're going to get some sort of blue sky thinking. And he did some research once on whether or not you should pee in the shower.
When you're already in the shower.
So we'll start off with Andrew with some initial remarks, and then we can let them debate amongst themselves. I'll ask them some questions and then open it up to the floor, and I'm really looking forward to your questions. So Andrew, start.
Right, well, good evening, and thanks a lot for the introduction, Louise. I'm saying it must have been about 35 years since I actually chased buffalo up and down the Himalayas, and I haven't really had to do much with buffalo since then, though it is actually coming onto UK farms now, so that might be a new ethical approach to something neat in the future, Louise. Right then, what I've set myself is, I'm afraid you can hear a lot about sustainable at the beginning. But I thought what I'd do is just try and scope out a little bit in 5 minutes about how, from an NFU and farming perspective, we approach the idea of being more sustainable. So for starters, when I'm thinking about sustainable, my scope is UK only. as a farmer's son and working with farmers, there's only so much we can do and so much a farm business can do. So you focus on what you can do in terms of that farm. But I'm conscious that when you make choices about what you buy, what you eat tonight and tomorrow when you go shopping, you have impacts on not just UK but whole of the world in terms of the economy. So it's not farms are part of the whole food chain, not just in the UK but across the globe. And I think it's important that we recognise that there is that global dimension. And when you talk about then sustainable production, there's a danger that it doesn't get hindered by tiresome things like provenance and seasonality. I think the approach that we now take with global consumption of food, the choice we have available, we don't get tied up in that sort of thing. And I think seasonality and provenance are important things. Also in the UK, as I say, well, I've said already that farmers got to be seen as part of the food chain. If we're not part of the food chain, seen as part of the food chain, farm businesses become very unsustainable, very economically unsustainable. You can't just make your own food chain, very few farms can. I think I make it clear at the beginning that farms are people too, farmers are people too. They go in the same, respond to the same drivers that you do when you're making choices. And if you want to encourage your colleagues, your friends, or farmers to become more sustainable, think about how you encourage it rather than how you penalise it and chastise them into the right place. I've certainly, my choice in my career has been to work within the farming community rather than stand on the outside throwing bricks at them. Farmers have a philosophy which is to live as if you will die tomorrow and farm as if you're going to live forever. That is something which farmers believe, and I think it's a good way of actually starting. If there's one thing that captures sustainability, I'd say that sort of approach has got to be centred to it. 5 things I say about approach to sustainability. It's not a fixed concept. What we regard as good practice today, our children will probably laugh at and think is absolutely astonishing bad practice. I only have to raise things like DDT as being a good and wonderful thing when I was a child in the 60s. For sustainability, the second thing, for me sustainability is a decision frame. So sustainability is about making choices and about knowledge, and how do we bring that knowledge to bear when people are making those choices. The third thing I say is every farm can be more sustainable. There's no fixed picture of what a sustainable farm is. Not only does it change over time, but every type of farm can be more sustainable, so let's make them all more sustainable. The fourth thing I'd say is sustainability is not easy, especially when you're dealing with the weather. What you choose to do might well turn out to be completely the wrong choice when it rains heavily 2 weeks after you've just sown a crop. What are the trade-offs? I can run a sustainable business from a wildlife point of view and actually not be very good from a water protection point of view. I could do great things for organic farming that be not very good from an archaeological point of view. So there are trade-offs in this. Think about those trade-offs. Climate change versus wildlife is an interesting trade-off. And then the final thing I'd say is, what about the things we don't know? One thing is clear as we move down, as we develop and know more, we know less about what we know, and we know more about things that we need to know about. And in a society in which technology and science is almost an evil word, I think actually we need more science and technology. So how do we get over that hurdle that's a real problem? Because if anything is going to be sustained, it's going to be because we know more. So just the last thing I'd say is that sustainability is not one fits all approach. It's a process that's continually evolving, and at heart it's about making the right choices with the right knowledge.
Angela, tell us why science is not an evil word.
Yes, thank you very much. So as you have my introduction, I work at Rothamsted Research, which is one of the oldest agricultural research institutions worldwide. It's still working on agriculture because we're focusing on sustainable agriculture. Now, I've been at Rothamsted since 1981. But actually what I want to talk about today isn't so much about any specific technology or why technology is a good or bad word, but how we need to change the way we do research if we are going to effectively transform agriculture to meet future needs under the pressing timetable that we have to do that. So we're going to have to accelerate in order to meet the challenges. And there's never been such a time as now when that's become increasingly important with the climate clock ticking and all sorts of big events happening globally. So I first want to remind you what innovation means, because innovation isn't just having a good idea. Innovation is the whole process of having a good idea and converting that into something useful, something that's better, something that makes a difference out there to users. It's not just an invention either. Lots of people invent things and they're never used. Innovation is the whole process, so I think you need to bear that in mind. And I think there are 3 reasons why research, as usual, whether you're talking about the agricultural sector or other sectors actually, doesn't really reach innovations in the way that we need pressingly to do now to transform our agriculture. And I think these go around how it's funded, how it's actually done, and also how it's incentivized. So if you just think about how it's funded for the moment, generally we have moved to a model where research is too prescribed. It's too risk averse, so most people save science, with few exceptions where blue skies kind of science is funded. A lot of our research today has to be prescribed, it has to be defended, it goes through peer review, gets mauled to death along the way usually. And you're often writing your research ideas a year in advance of actually starting your projects. So that in itself is not conducive to flexible, agile innovations which meet user needs now and change with the time. And you need to always prove you can achieve something in order to get someone to put the funding behind it. In terms of how it's done, I think research has been held along what's largely a linear model of doing innovation, where most people focus first on the research, the quality of their research and building the knowledge, and of course that is important. We need to have evidence base behind our decisions. But often the outcome and the useful bits is left right to the end. And sometimes what people find is after 3 years of doing research, what they produced actually wasn't as useful as they thought, or aspects of what they were doing should have been done differently to have made it much more useful to the people that they thought they were doing it for. And then the final thing is the incentives as too much on scientific excellence. Now that might sound like a highly provocative thing to say in an institution like this. Of course we have to have excellent science, but if you just use excellent science as a metric, you run the risk that people's end goal is to produce a paper in Nature or produce a paper in Science, and from their point of view they've achieved their goal. Whereas actually what we need to think about is what's the outcomes, who's going to use that, what difference did that paper in Nature make or Science make out there? What are the step changes that it achieved? So these are the problems I think that we have to really grapple with, and we have to think about changing those research models. I'm not suggesting we replace what we do now, but I think what we need to think about to really transform agriculture for the future is a new way of doing research as well. And in that new way of doing research, what we need to do is we need to engage with users much earlier and in an iterative way. And that can mean farmers. Our assumptions, we need to test with those users. Are our assumptions about the research correct or not? And we need to do that early, and we need to iterate that testing process. And each time we need to use that feedback to refocus our efforts on what's valuable about the usefulness of the research. And we need to reward individuals for being entrepreneurial, for spending time out, taking risks that may fail, because we need to do that as well as the safe stuff. So my message that I would like to leave you is, where do we grow from here? Well, to answer that, the current research model is not going to deliver what we need. We need, in addition, new ways of working and not just research as usual.
Thanks very much. Steve, how a big business can I make this happen?
Hopefully, I'll tell you. Good afternoon, everybody. I apologise, I'm going to take these on and off for the whole time. I'm not used to wearing glasses, and I can't see you a bit more, and I can't see my paper a bit more. So I do apologise. A little bit about my background, very quickly, so you know where I'm coming from. I've worked in and around agricultural policy for about the last 10 years. But I've worked in and around animal welfare as a scientist, as a researcher, and more recently as a consultant for about the last 20 years. So hopefully this qualifies me to make some dispassionate, informed view on our current and future food production. I'm going to use some examples in the next few minutes, mostly from the field of farm animal welfare. When I talk about animal welfare examples, you can substitute your own examples to do with the environment or other aspects of sustainability. It's simply that animal welfare is one criteria that we can call upon. I'm going to focus quite a bit on business and how business approaches things. So if you'd let me, 5 observations on sustainable food production and the role of producers, consumers, NGOs, institutions, and governments in delivering this. Before those, I have 3 useful pointers which I think we need to take into account. The first follows on from what Andrew said. We're not talking about just one place here. Andrew talks about the UK. Many food businesses are truly global. They exist across continents and they operate in similar ways across continents. They are a significant size and scale. And we in the UK are not in the centre of those global industries. We are to the side of many of them. If I give you an example of size and scale, I quickly looked at the last accounts for Danish Crown before I came out today. Their last reported revenue was around 7 billion euros. They kill 20 million pigs a year, or just over, and they operate across continents. These are very big organisations. We don't change them with minor policy changes within one country. We have to take a broader approach to that. The second issue, if I can work out how to do this, we've seen a massive amount of consolidation in the food sector at producer, processor and retailer level. These are figures from the UK. Roughly 80% of pigs are slaughtered in just 8 abattoirs in this country. Each of those abattoirs slaughters roughly 900,000 animals per year. It goes up and up as the years go on. About 69% of milk is processed by just 8 companies. The average yield of milk per cow has risen from around 6,500 litres per year in 2000 to just under 8,000 litres in the current year. The number of producers has declined by about 50% at the same time. So lower producers, higher yield per cow, we actually produce roughly the same amount of milk overall. And 70% of our groceries are purchased from just 4 retailers. Now consolidation concentrates power, but it also drives efficiencies, and it forces companies to be far more aware of the risks to their business. And those businesses could be from consumers, they could be from the environment, there are many. The third point here, just before I start on the main observations, is that when we boil it down to the hard facts, the responsibility of businesses is to deliver value to shareholders. It is not the responsibility of food businesses to feed the world. That responsibility belongs to you, me, NGOs and governments and people who actually choose what food to eat or define what policies we have for our agriculture and food sectors. There may be common interests, but we're different drivers. So, 5 observations. First of all, it's customers who drive farm animal welfare improvements, thus customers who drive all improvements in sustainability. Businesses look at animal welfare as they do any other risk factor or selling point. For many of those businesses dealing directly with consumers, including many meat processors and food service companies, farm animal welfare is an established factor in product differentiation. However, pork animal welfare is not properly considered a risk or a valuable selling point, with many business-to-business food companies who do not actually have any customer face. The lack of exposure to consumer pressures means that business-to-business food companies are often not needed to address animal welfare or many other sustainability issues. And I have no doubt that will be the same across the board. Secondly, transparency matters. The items that we've seen move to higher welfare or higher sustainability in production have generally been those which are easily identified as of animal origin at the point of purchase. So, we have free-range shell eggs, we have free-range sausages, pasture-fed beef, and so on. There's been far less impetus from industry to develop product lines with higher welfare ingredients. They're simply not as seen. That's not to say that nothing has happened in these areas, and what we have to be very aware of is branded goods, higher value branded goods, such as you might think of those produced by Unilever, Ben & Jerry's and Barilla, in the past, for example. There are companies across the board with high value branded goods who actually have insisted on having higher welfare ingredients. Now, there's twofold outcomes to this. They get a little bit of market differentiation. They get an awful lot of brand value protection. So there is a motivation there within industry to actually generate or enhance sustainability. Third point, I've got 2 minutes left.
Yep.
Yeah, brilliant. Third point here. One, okay. Narrative matters. Businesses address issues with proven customer or government concern. They don't go around digging issues up for us to be concerned about. We don't see companies differentiating products on animal welfare grounds in the absence of a well-versed narrative about why those grounds matter. And companies don't create those narratives. We do, NGOs do, charities do. And that is our responsibility and not the responsibility of companies. I will give a long example. So, it's a slightly off piece compared to the other things, but industry has a role, and it's a very clear role, I think, to provide collective responses to consumer concerns. For dispersed farmers, this is particularly for primary producers, if you think of the many thousands of small farm businesses throughout the UK, throughout the EU, throughout the globe, there is now, and there might always be, a reliance on either corporate or producer bodies to develop collective approaches to dealing with issues of farm animal welfare. In the UK, we've seen the big tractor standards, then we've seen corporate issues. A corporate example would be Arla, the 5th largest dairy producer in the world, has put together its own standards and applies them across about 12,500 dairy producers. Final point is that big business does not necessarily mean bad business. When they make changes, big businesses make big impacts. When I quickly looked at the Compassion in World Farming website before I came out, they estimate that the companies with which they have worked to stop using eggs from battery cage systems have impacted on the lives of around 53 million laying hens. Those businesses are generally big businesses, and that's the way to make a very big impact. I'll stop there. I think with putting this together, there were about 50 or so other observations that could be made which were equally relevant, but I thought I'd leave it at 5.
Dave, if you'd like to tell us more about
the second slide.
What kind of policies might help to improve food production or sustainable?
Okay, I'll have a go. I was going to do a presentation, but I'm not going to because I've been on phrases and I want to get home bored. This is the only slide I wanted to use out of all the ones I've got. And this is from, I'm going to further complicate things. Like every speaker, I think, every speaker I think has taken a slightly broader definition of what sustainable food means. And there's some things that you could also chuck in there as well. So this is the Economics Foundation's 8 indicators of what a truly sustainable food system might look like. You've got your environmental ones in there, biodiversity, the sort of things the guys were talking about earlier. But you've also got quality of jobs, you've got affordability, the price of food, you've got supply chains and how those things work. And I'll just leave that up while I'm talking, and I was going to talk a bit more about it. But the point I suppose I wanted to make is that we're at a very interesting time right now for looking at this, which is the food system, which is all of it. And Andrew's absolutely spot on that farms are just one part of it, and farms are subject to the pressures in there as much as everyone else. And that is because of Brexit, which is a thing that is happening, which we're going to have to think about the implications of. It is an opportunity in many ways, in principle at least, to do food very differently. It's also a risk, and it's very, very likely that what we might see is a lot of this stuff getting worse. So, first thing about it is to talk about the cost of food for a bit. And I hope we kick this around a bit today and on this table, because it's actually the driving thing. And I think Steve's right. In a way, that consumers are sovereign, and I think there's clearly a role for government in that. But the cost of food is such a political issue. People are weird about food. People are weird about the cost of food. People little bit about the cultural implications of it. You've only got to look at the implication of Marmite getting 10 pence more expensive and what that does to see what we mean by that. And we're about to have food potentially getting more expensive. That's about to be a thing that could happen. And a lot of the things that we need to do to address the failing food system imply, at least in principle, paying more for food somewhere. So that might be paying more for the costs of the environmental pollution that basically isn't really taken into account very much, or the costs to the health service from obesity from healthy foods, or from failing antibiotics, from over medication, you name it, as well as all of the stuff that you guys talked about earlier about water quality, etc. So I think we need to look a bit at the cost of food and start thinking about whether we are at an opportunity to talk differently about that. I know actually it's something in Louise's book that you looked at as well, the cost of food. The second thing is about the role of government. So I'm pleased that no one else has talked about that huge amount yet. And a lot of what we need to do probably requires regulation, or it might be regulation, or taxation, or cutting taxes on healthy things in order to increase taxes on unhealthy things. And the reality is that over the last 5 years, and this is where we are right now, it's getting harder and harder in the UK, and we may as well start there, to regulate. It's getting harder and harder to do it. There are now new government rules that say for every one new regulation you want to bring in that costs £100 a business, you have to scrap 3 regulations somewhere else that save business £300 for £100 each. There is now more and more emphasis on impact assessments in policy making, which require you to convert all of this stuff into a monetary value and trade it off against the costs of implementing it, which is very difficult to do. And all the departments have, at the moment, they certainly have, whether they still have them, we'll wait to see, explicit targets to get rid of regulation purely to save money, purely to hack out the cost to business part of that. So whether or not that's viable in the context of Brexit, we'll have to see. And a lot of what we're going to talk about here is going to imply government action, and I think we need to be clear-eyed about that being a bit difficult. The final point I wanted to chuck in is Brexit, and everyone's already thoroughly bored of it, but it's here, it's a thing, it's going to happen. For some reason we decided we were going to do that. And that is only going to increase, I think. So, okay, let's look at farming. Farming subsidies is the thing that we have to do again from scratch, or at least in principle, we have to do it again from scratch. Whether we will or not is up for debate. We have an opportunity to look at all of this stuff, to take the debate much broader than farming subsidies, and indeed farming policy, and look at what sort of food system do we want to have. But there are very powerful people on all sides of the debate lining up already. There are potatoes already being thrown around. The government's facing economic challenges ahead, it's already seen that, so there's huge pressure on the cost of food. And if you wanted to, even if you did want to radically change the way farming subsidies work to much more incentivise green practices, which over the long run would be great, if you did that overnight, you would push loads of farmers into bankruptcy. So how do you do it? Are we really going to take this opportunity to do farming subsidies differently or not? I hope that in the next couple of years there is the space for that sort of debate. We'll have to see, I suppose. So, 3 recommendations really to think about. And the first is that Brexit does offer an opportunity really for the UK to make a choice. In a way that, actually, okay, this is a global issue, but this is the most interesting place in the world right now for some of this stuff, because we do have explicit choices to make about what sort of food system we want to have, what sort of economy we want to have. Do we want to have high standards or low standards? Was Brexit a vote for lower farm animal welfare? Was it a vote for scrapping regulations in the name of competitiveness? Or was it a vote actually for pride in the country, and how do we do that? So we, the collective we, I think, need to be taking this opportunity to say let's raise the bar and lower it. Secondly, all of these hidden costs. There are loads of people, academics, think tanks, NFU themselves, looking at these hidden costs. Let's start getting those into the debate when we're looking at subsidies. So we're looking at the cost of the NHS pay, which we all pay. We're looking at all of these, the hidden costs of over-medication, for example, and look at that all in the round. And then thirdly, let's start getting serious about specific environmental strategies. The Committee on Climate Change, which advises the government on its climate policy, has said just last week, and it said it very recently again, that of all of the bits of the UK economy, it's agriculture that's the one that's not pulling its weight, it's not doing enough. And I know it's not easy, and Andrew's absolutely right about that. But if we are serious about increasing the sustainability of our food, then we need proper strategies to deal with it. We can probably start with a decent climate and agriculture strategy.
Thanks a lot, David. I'm going to ask the panel a few questions now. Just to remind you the question, how we grow from here towards sustainable food production. And I'd really like to get some concrete answers that you can take away, so it's not all just lots of ideas, but really some answers to how we take things forward. So I'm going to ask a few individual panellists for my own interest, so that I can draw out some answers, and then I'll open it up to the floor. So I know we're on board with Brexit, but I was genuinely interested from Andrew to find out the positives of Brexit for us, and I'm thinking about wildlife and farming, because obviously the European Union, the CAP system has paid farmers for environmental stewardship schemes for the last 40 years, or however long that's been going. So can we improve on that? And how can BAP, which we're calling it, the British Agricultural Policy, do it better, Andrew?
Okay, part of the reason that I think Louise is asking this is when we were having a conversation, I said, I'm absolutely fed up with Brexit.
Torturing.
But no, I mean, it's Brexit is, the reason I'm fed up is I've been talking about Brexit for 9 months, possibly a year, probably as many times, and I've chaired as many meetings about...
Give us some positives.
Yes, so positive anyway.
Yes.
So look, the country has decided, your grandmothers and grandfathers have voted where you're going to be going, and the rest of the country apart from London. I mean, I had to find my way to the polling booth past old people. It was extraordinary. The positive of Brexit, the country's decided where it's going to go. It's absolutely vital that we make the best of it. There was at the referendum we were presented with a binary choice between out and in, and it was never a binary choice. We could have stayed in and had a bad deal, or had a good deal staying in, and exactly the same way going out. So NFU's perspective on this, and farmers' perspective, and I've spoken to thousands of our members about it, is the country's chosen, let's get on and make the best of it. Because if we don't go and push hard to go and argue why farming is going to be an important part of the Brexit solution, then actually the rest of the economy and the rest of politics will find it very difficult. Because we think that Brexit is absolutely a bellwether. I think it's all been mentioned, a bellwether of good EU policy. So the things we can do, one of the reasons that we found, I think people voted out, was they were fed up with the common agricultural policy. Well, in fact, now we've got an opportunity to design a policy that's fit for the UK. So fit for the UK, which actually recognises that we want to produce food, but we've also got a whole lot of other things we want to get out of farming as well. How do we design a policy that actually allows farmers to run sustainable businesses, economically sustainable, but also environmentally sustainable? Can we actually look at, instead of just having a food system, a farming system that feeds 60% of the nation's needs, can we see if we produce more of the nation's needs from the UK produce? At the moment, in terms of dairy production, we only meet 80% of dairy needs. Now, if there's one part of Europe where we should be self-sufficient in dairy products and able to export, it's the British Isles and UK, and yet we're only doing 80% because we've got a processing sector and a government policy which doesn't favour dairy production, and actually EU policy has prevented us from expanding. We have some of the most competitive dairy businesses, farm businesses out there. So there are big things that we can do, and we can do it in a way which actually suits the UK.
And I think in the UK, we think of the countryside for all of us. So I'd be really interested, Steve, how people can get involved, how their consumer choices might make a difference. And a really good example you came up with was cage-free eggs. You know, people's demand has made that happen. What other things can we as consumers make happen that could force more sustainable methods?
I think I'm not going to be quite so positive, really.
Yeah.
In that I think there's a huge risk as we see currency fluctuations, which make it very, very tempting to increase exports, increase production over and above where it should be. So I think there's a chance that we could push to become too intensive, and we need to maintain that balance. So it will be low for NGOs to lobby on that side. At the same time, I know we've done a small survey recently of young farmers. And one of the things that seems to be coming out of that is, from a young farmer's perspective, they want to at least maintain and perhaps enhance the EU regulations and directives we have in place on the environment and on animal welfare. And that's not for any ecological reason or for fluffy bunny reasons, that's purely because they want to maintain an export market. So it could well be that we maintain exactly the same position as we have, purely so that we can ship goods overseas. Now that doesn't resolve the 60% food production, food security we have, which I don't think we'll ever resolve.
Well, couldn't that just be by encouraging more people to buy British produce? Perhaps an answer. One thing you said was about how all businesses owe their shareholders. I thought perhaps it's not just about shareholder value, it's about the wider environment, because if you're just looking at your shareholders and ignoring the environment, then there's no food production. So, David, how can we encourage businesses to look at not just shareholder value perhaps, but how they produce food without damaging the environment?
So I think, I was a bit struck by that as well. I think so the first thing is, I think we can look at some examples of things like around, for example, the sugar tax, where government has actually got to the point with voluntary agreements with businesses just doing what their shareholders want, has actually said, no, that's not good enough, we need to do something about it. So I think that's come through years and years of health campaigning and pressure on government. So there's a role for government, firstly, to set the standards that holds business to account. But the other thing is actually, I think, in a way that debate is changing as well. In the climate change debate more generally, over the last 5 years, the seismic thing has happened around the narrative around carbon mathematics and stranded assets, and the idea that actually you're not necessarily acting in the long-term interest of your shareholders if you're plunging loads of money into oil and gas because we're going to get in the ground, right? And interestingly, that's starting to go into other areas as well. So there are some people looking at that now, the factory farming, for example, and have started to do that same basic concept and have said, well, if we assume that people are going to eat less meat, and we've got all these climate targets, and people care about animal welfare, and et cetera, import costs, is plunging all this money into factory farming really such a good idea? And you might start to see that debate changing as well. And Steve's absolutely spot on, that people, I think particularly when you look at areas like factory farming, people have this intrinsic sort of discomfort with it, I think. And there's all sorts of reasons why, as Andrew said, I think 20 years from now we might look at an industry like that and think, how do we ever...
How do you encourage an industry to make those decisions?
Well, so...
do you think it has to be government-led, or can consumers do something?
I think, so consumers can always do something. We've seen huge steps forward in poultry is a very good example of it, sustainability in big companies. That's certainly true. But food is one of those really intractable issues. I mean, you wrote a whole book about it.
Yeah.
Is the disconnection between the food on your plate.
I'll give you another really good example. This week, Tyson Foods, who produce pretty much all the world's chickens, I'm sure Steve's aware of, not responsible for them, aware of them. They've invested in a company called Beyond Meat, which is making chicken substitutes. So that's basically like British American Tobacco investing in e-cigarettes. They're thinking of where it's going. So just before I open up to the floor, I thought I'd give Andrew an opportunity to speak. You talked about taking risks and more risky research. Did you have anything in mind that might help companies and farmers produce more sustainable food?
Well, I think it's important to think about how we've got to where we are now, and I think we need to be aware that we've been through, in effect, two revolutions. So the Green Revolution was a mixture of genetics and agronomy. So, for example, the fact you had dwarfing genes, shorten the height of cereal, plus more nitrogen, meant that people grow these things and they didn't fall over due to excess nitrogen. And then we've had a sort of revolution which is around the agrochemistry, which is protecting and getting more productivity out of our agriculture, so more from the land. So the big question is, what's the next revolution going to be that's going to provide sustainable agriculture in the future? Bearing in mind we want to actually get more with less. It's not a trivial challenge. So is it going to be digital? Are the farms of our future going to have drones flying over them, robotics sort of tractors all over them, and is it going to be something like that? Automised, farming in effect? Or is it going to be biologic, which is a sort of replacement? And that's the high risk stuff. How prepared are we for disruptive innovations which affect our food and our farming? That's a question for you, and I think it's a serious question, because if we're going to meet this food production that we require in the future, we're going to have to think about some pretty disruptive approaches to achieve that now. We're running out of chemistry, and we're running out of options. So be prepared for some high-risk stuff. Are we ready for that?
Wow, I could talk to you all evening about what that disruptive innovations mean. I feel quite frightened by it, and I know you're like, we need to take risks, but I'm like, oh, don't mess with nature. But that's not going to annoy you.
We have.
Well, I guess so. Right, I'm going to open it up to the floor. We have some amazing experts here, so please put up your hands. I'll try to take maybe 3 questions at a time, maybe 2 at a time, I think, to start, and keep them coming. This gentleman right in the front row.
Yes, my name is Stefano Powell. I'm, let's say, developing a new startup. It's called the Strategic Advanced Model Online. And my question is, I do appreciate Professor Angela Karp when she talks about innovation. Now, then I did not appreciate the idea of Brexit is better or worse than Europe. I don't think that the strategy of Europe has put in place for the agriculture is some kind of called smart strategy specialization. What does it mean?
Question.
The question is that I'm talking about the risk, because I'm going straight to the question. You don't have enough data in agriculture in UK in order to get a decision. That's what the government is doing now. It's trying to collect for different departments of UK data centralized in order to start have some kind of where to go. Now, data means innovation. Innovation is a process, I agree with Professor Angela Karp, that you need a strategy. Where is the strategy? So that's where the risk comes. So you don't know where to go because you don't have data. So if you don't have data, you don't have innovation, you don't have even a process, a strategy. There's a link each one. Europe is trying to develop this type of approach. Thank you.
Brilliant. I'll take another question.
How do you think tackling food waste can contribute to sustainability?
Yeah. How do we think tackling food waste can contribute to the problem? And I'll take one more, please. Right up at the top there. Or there. Thank you.
I find that often eating meat can be a bit of a sacred cow, to excuse the metaphor.
Yeah.
How do you feel that veganism or plant-based diets can help create a more sustainable system and, to quote Angela, get more from less?
There's 3 really interesting questions. I think we'll start off with Angela answering this question at the front row, which I think was talking about the fact that we don't even have the information to make up a strategy. So how do we do that before then starting this disruptive innovation?
I think that's a very good point. There is a huge push though at the moment for data integration, and I think that's why. So, for example, one of the agri-tech centres is called AgriMetrics, and Rothamsted is involved in that, and that's all about integrating data. So I think you did make a very important point, and that EU has a real push on what they call responsible innovation, and we have much to learn, I think, from that sort of process. So, for me, there are lots of good things about what the EU is doing. We're not suggesting we drop all of those. We've just got an opportunity to rethink what the UK should be doing within that context. I hope that's going to answer the question.
Fantastic.
I just want to say one point about the people joining the
Take
So don't forget that a large amount of our land area in the UK is grassland. So a question is, if you're not using grassland to convert it into beef, if you like, what will that mean for that land area? And the risk of actually converting that into something else could be a bigger emissions loss than actually what it's doing at the moment. I just want to throw that in. So it's never such a simple thing in the balance as one might think.
Not at all. I'm going to let David talk about food waste and because I'm sure he's aware of some innovative ways we might reduce food waste, or Steve, perhaps how big businesses are doing that, and then I want to talk very quickly about that meat question. And Steve does too.
I want to talk about the meat question first.
Okay, let's just stick, but we're going to get to that food waste question too.
Yes, we are.
Which is linked because the pigs could eat the food waste.
Well, so the only thing I really wanted, the thing I wanted to say on the meat thing was that everything you read, everyone who produces anything, the World Food Organization, everyone who produces anything at all says we as a global society have to eat less meat, or more accurately, we cannot eat as much meat as Western countries currently do. Now, what I think is really interesting, if you look at vegetarianism and veganism over the last 10 years, and I know this from personal experience, is the transformation in the perception of what it means to be vegetarian or vegan over that time. It's now seen as a healthy thing to do. It's seen as a cool thing to do, and that's something that's happened. I think as a health agenda, more than anything else, has been the thing that's driven that. And partially, I think we're seeing that through the rise of obesity in our society, but partially we're seeing it through prices rising for meat and things like that as well. So this is going back to the whole sort of drivers of the broader food system stuff, but actually the real way you're going to get people to eat less meat is making them feel like there's something better they can have instead, and that's partially a factor of cost, and incorporating the costs of all this better. But also just more and more of the health messaging coming out, I think will do that, and there's a real role for public health in this to carry on doing that. I don't have anything massively innovative to say about food waste, but I did want to say my statistic, which is that there's £1 billion of food wasted every year that's never even open. So that's what's bought. So it's absolutely massive.
And I'd just like to, I'll come back to you, Steve, but Andrew, to take a step back, because I know that food waste isn't always about, the bread that we throw away. Actually, a huge amount of it is as it's harvested, isn't it? And farming itself, especially in the developing world, could waste a lot less food and get it to hungry people.
Well, look, it can do. I mean, you see it most obviously in terms of horticulture and fruit and veg. But you see it in horticulture and fruit and veg because consumers, we are told, or is it retailers, I'm not sure which, but in that store, when a choice is taken about what you'll pick up, you don't pick up a wonky carrot or a blemished apple, you pick up one that looks pretty and is pre-packaged. And one way to sort out food waste is actually pre-pack food, pre-cut it, so that there isn't that cosmetic choice that's made. We've seen, and there's been great programs highlighting food waste on the farm. Don't think that food goes to waste. Cute farm businesses actually turn the substandard, the Class B, Class C fruit and veg into soup, cut it up. They'll send it to anaerobic digestion, they'll send it to animal feed. There's a whole range of different things there. I just wanted to have a go at the vegan question, because the great thing about vegans is they eat food, and farmers produce food. So I don't see that as necessarily a problem. What I do see as a slight problem is whether the vegan food you eat is actually produced by UK farmers. And I'm not sure that we have the type of farming systems, certainly not in terms of soy-based product. Beans are quite difficult for us to grow. So what I'm concerned is that you might not be buying UK product. It would be great if you could, and we need to perhaps think about that. And the other point is a point that Angela's already made, is that 45, nearly 50% of the UK won't ever grow a veg crop. It certainly won't grow beans and soya. So what do we do with that? What I'd like to do is make sure we do something with it that actually makes profit for the farmers that own it, and manage it.
We do grow some beans. We export most of them to Egypt, and there's a wonderful company called Hodmedod's which grows British beans, if that's what you want to buy. But I'm going to let Steve come in here on if he's got anything to add on food waste, because I know that's such a huge area for where savings might be made.
I'm only going to reiterate very quickly.
Okay.
Food waste occurs in the home. That's where the issue is. It isn't on farm. It isn't in business, because businesses lose money through food waste. They have to pay for it. In the home, we don't. That's where it occurs. That's where we need to be careful.
Okay, so you're looking at more awareness from the public, and perhaps that awareness to eat and buy ugly food as well. Yeah. And what about them? You know, you're an expert in animal.
Yeah, I think the calculations of carbon outputs and luminance are generally based on, it's generally based on cereal-fed luminance, not on grass-fed beef and sheep, which we tend to have in this country. We have some cereal going into them. But pasture-fed beef and sheep we know are less damaging to the environment. That said, veganism is less damaging still. So I can't criticise veganism at all, or vegetarianism.
Yeah. And I'd say something similar, that we're all there's all this new technology, maybe even the first insect farm is opening in the UK, creating cricket powder. So there's lots of other ways to get protein. It is moving in that direction, but then there's also the beautiful meat we can buy from where other things can't be grown. So let's get 3 more questions, please. Right in the middle here, this gentleman here with the yellow tie, and then perhaps over here.
I'm not quite sure whether this evening is focused on the UK or Europe or the world, but
we're going global.
My question is to the world. As I see it, we're locked in for the last 10,000 years into a paradigm where we believe that farming involves plants, involves land, involves fresh water. In practice, that's completely false. So that's only a small subset of what farming could be, because 97% of the world's water is seawater, and for some reason there are thousands of naturally occurring plants that grow in seawater. We pump a large amount of fresh water onto the land, but we don't ever pump seawater onto the land. The question is, when are we going to break out of this paradigm and realize that there's a whole multiplicity of different forms of farming with seawater, growing salt-tolerant plants, and turning arid land into productive farming?
That's a really excellent question. There was someone in this corner with a question as well.
Hi, yes. Mine's on a global matter as well. So a recent report from the FAO about the state of food in 2016 just said that there's up to 122 million people, particularly small-scale farmers, who are going to be subject to extreme poverty by 2030. And in the report they state that they need to double down on sustainable farming techniques. My question is, do you think that sustainable farming techniques are really going to be able to facilitate preventing 122 million individuals from being affected by this climate change effect?
Those 2 questions overlap nicely. There was a question down here as well, please. This gentleman here.
Hello. So some would argue that the problem with the food system is less about food production and the problem of food waste, and more to do with food distribution and access to food. And when we look at that, then we start arguing that actually it's less of a technological problem and it's more of a social problem, and it needs a social solution to it. Now the problem with that is, in addition to it being a social solution, you also have to look at the operational model of big businesses. And these things like the social problem and the operational model of big businesses, like Steve mentioned, is driven by government policies and government influence, like David also mentioned. So what is the panel's view on the importance of food distribution and the access to food versus focusing on food production and food waste. For example, the US overproducing wheat on US subsidies and then dumping it in poor countries and decimating the local food system over there. And just to add on to that, if the government is essentially driving that agenda or has to drive that agenda, then how would small businesses and startups in the food industry try to address these big picture social problems? Where would they fit in?
That's an excellent question. I think those first two we could probably take together, because the gentleman's first question, of how we're going to bring in these innovative ways using seawater, perhaps using vertical gardening, how perhaps we might use that to help feed those 122 million people by 2030. So I think, I'll ask Angela what research and innovation might help to do that.
I think that sustainable practices will be actually key to helping those people, because what we need is more resource use efficient farming, and that's what we're moving towards now. We need, particularly with respect to soils, we need to understand what's a healthy soil, how do we keep a healthy soil, and we also need to understand not just about amount, but also about quality, because it's not just the amount of food, it's micronutrients and the quality of food that's important in terms of feeding people. So I think we've actually learned a lot of things from trying to achieve sustainable intensification in our farming system that will really benefit those people, because resource use is a key issue. I think the diversification one is more tricky, because and I think that's why I said that the route forward is participatory innovation. Because we could come up with all sorts of solutions, but if local people don't want to adopt those for a whole pile of reasons, they won't take off. So I think it's very, very important that we do explore and diversify our routes to production, but that needs to be done in a way that engages with those people who are in those regions who can be part of that production system. Because if they're not engaged from the start, then we will run into difficulty.
Andrew, do you have anything to add to any of the innovative examples that Ryan mentioned about, using seawater and things?
Yeah, I mean, we are very, very lucky in the UK that we have an environment which naturally grows, a temperate environment which naturally grows. But I'm very conscious dealing with World Farming Organisation colleagues. Many parts of the world are exactly the sort of situation with drought and impoverished soils and climate change, which is making the situation worse. Ultimately, I think every farmer, it comes down to soil and actually understanding your soil. And I think it's one thing we've learned in the UK in the last, and farmers are, in the time I did environmental science undergraduate degree in the early 80s with agriculture students. And they didn't really think anything of the environment, they didn't think it was something that's important. I kept up with my agriculture colleagues in my job. And earlier this year I went to stay with one of them. He gave me a lecture of half an hour about soil and organic content. And I stopped him after half an hour and said, look, hang on a minute, this is what we were talking about in the 1980s, and now you're telling me this is important. It's starting to happen with farms now, understanding the importance of organic content, and I think that's an important change. It's exactly the same in these other countries. Let's look at the soil. The solution is in the soil.
Too late before
No,
talked about the loss of soil.
That. But as long as it's not done at them, it's done with them, which I think is the point that Angela's talking about.
And let's move on to the next question about food distribution. Steve, would you like to talk about that, about how we might be able to get sustainable food to the people who need it?
Very sadly, I can only agree with you that it's unfortunate. Food distribution is allied very much to wealth distribution and to the distribution of political power on a global basis. You can't get away from it. So if somebody has little power and little money, they are going to suffer. Can we force countries in the West, so there's primarily the West, to do things about it? Yes, we can, but it's entirely through lobbying and lobbying against large businesses who could potentially lose a lot of money.
And And what about the New Economics Foundation? I hope you've got something more positive to say to this gentleman.
Well, no, I think Steve's absolutely right. Actually, it's about the food system is so interlocked with the economic system and who gets to have what. Food is a basic right, but yet we still have food poverty in this country, just like energy is a basic right, we still have energy poverty. You can't really do something about food poverty without doing something about poverty, to be honest, or at least that's a very crude categorisation of the two things. So I think that we, at least not unless you're prepared to do something about the price of food issue as well. For as long as we demand cheap food, for as long as that's what everyone is marketing us, and we get cheeseburgers for 99 pence and everybody shops around on the basis of cheap stuff, for as long as that happens, I think you have to look to broader government policy to do something about it. I do think you're right, but I think actually it's not either or, I think it's all of these things. Well, the role of strong government policy is to drive technological innovation, to get money where it needs to be, to give the right signals to farmers, to get young farmers coming in with new ideas, to change social awarenesses, to change the law, to do all of these things. That's why really we want to do something about sustainability of the whole food system. You have to have a vision for what that whole food system is going to do. I would caution against seeing it as it's this or it's that, actually the whole kind of thing. And that starts from, and as I said at the start, this is an opportunity we have got to have that sort of conversation.
Angela wants to come in on this as well.
I just want to make the point that I know a few startups. Actually, it is an area where startups can actually have a big role, because they often come in with very innovative ideas about how to connect farmers up to markets, for example. So I've seen a number of startup companies with very simple solutions of enabling farmers to know where they can market their things, or even connecting to a very simple transport service that collects their stuff before it rots. So it's also a food waste issue. And these are actually fairly simple things that are done using mobile phones, which, in many countries, that's a way of actually reaching a lot of farmers out in very remote areas. Simple apps that enable them to get their products on time, access stuff on time, because it's also accessing stuff they need for their production system. So there's a lot of movement in the startup area there, which is doing good stuff.
Would you like to say very quickly?
Yeah, and that made me think something I was going to say earlier as well, which is that I think a vehicle for innovation that hasn't probably been explored yet is local authorities and local areas. Now, what about if you were to give a city, let's say Bristol, for argument's sake, you were to give it full control of its public health spending, you were allowed it to raise tax on things as it wanted to, you allowed it to work with the farmers, if you really, really did that on a long enough time scale in a way that wouldn't scare people, would you start getting individual places coming up with really innovative local solutions? Because you're absolutely right, actually a lot of this is about moving food around, and maybe that would start to get.
It's good to say something positive, and I think the internet could really help that as well. Then organisations like Farm Drop and stuff, which are directly, if big business is not going to help, let's do it without them. Some 3 more questions, please. This, I'm afraid, might be the last round. We've got someone up at the top there.
Hi, thanks for the session. What role do you believe eco-labels should or will play in the future, especially those integrating LCNs?
Brilliant. There's a lady down here, please, next.
I just wonder what key challenges would the panel see in relation to combining the organic content, health, and basically responding to food accessibility and looking at the shareholder values. I also am not sure if I'm buying into, because we are mentioning the health issues, I'm not sure if I'm buying into vegan as a solution, because we, in the context of the latest research that is coming from Harvard, saying that basically no human has an enzyme to digest grasses, which means wheat and all that, so gluten basically. And as a result, we have more and more sensitivity to gluten, not necessarily celiac sensitivities, and basically more challenges in terms of organic content and health as relation to sugar.
Good to have health mentioned. And we have a question up here.
I have worked as an agricultural professional in many countries. What I see as a problem is with the current population growth, while the land remains limited, in the West, production per hectare has reached near the limit or the limit. Let's say near the limit, there may be a little room more. What I mean is production per hectare may be, say, 7-8 tons. It may go to 10-12. In the developing world, it's about 1 ton. There is a big disparity there. The same happens with the carrying capacity of grassland for animals. It can only carry a certain number of animals per limited area. Now, as we reach the limit of production, where is the food going to come from? Where is the sustainability? Yes, the question to Angela. I cannot see any innovative way. Some people are going to get hungry. Someone mentioned 122 million. In fact, I worked for FAO. It was 1 billion a few years ago. 1 billion people were going hungry. Now, I personally don't see where the sustainable food production is going to come in the foreseeable future. Plus, we have limited ourselves to very few plants and animals for our consumption. Recently, a crop called quinoa has been coming into the market. You see the price is already quite inflated. Unless you move to other types of plants and animals that we haven't eaten, you mentioned crickets. I find it very difficult.
Okay, let's start off with that question because that's really the key, isn't it? How can we produce more with less? Angela and Andrew, I think I'll start with that. And I'm going to finish with the eco-labels because that will have to be the last question. I think it really gets to the key. But first of all, how are we going to produce more food on less land?
Well, I think this is it's actually just, I think I'd make it even simpler than that. It's actually how to produce more with less. And that is the golden thread that's running through farm business thinking at the present moment. Because if we can produce more with less, that probably means we're running more profitable businesses. It probably also means that actually having less pressure on the environment because we're using the product we do put on the land in a more intelligent way. One of the points we always talk to about farmers is from an agronomy point of view is to make sure that the product you put on, pesticides, fertilisers, even the seeds themselves, it only actually goes on the crop, it doesn't go anywhere else, and it has actually an impact. And so the more we can focus in on efficiency and not doing any more intervention than we absolutely need to go and get their given output. And that is a common theme across all farm businesses. That's why I say sustainability applies to every farm business, whether it's in the UK, big or small, across the whole world. That is what we need to do, and that should be good from a climate point of view, as well as from a business point of view. And when you have the two things running together, where business and environmental good, public good is going in the same direction, and that is going to be a good place. That's where we want to focus.
And Angela, more with less, perhaps also taking into account, while you're speaking, some health concerns as well, because that to take this lady's question into account.
Well, I think it's very interesting that what we're seeing at the moment is a big push towards what's called kind of One Health strategy, which is really connecting up what's happening all the way in farm, from the soil. There's nutrients in the soil that are picked by the animal or crops and end up in food, as our food. So I think part of the answer is also integrating across those sectors, which traditionally we haven't done that well. And actually thinking about nutrient flows all the way from what we do at the beginning of the food chain right to, and I think someone made the point that if we do it and think about it's all part of the food production system. I think the other thing to bear in mind is that actually yield increases are not continuing to rise. So if you look at wheat, if you look at oilseed rape, you've still got a big margin there to actually improve yield. But it comes back to this question about what sorts of innovations you prepared for us to deploy in order to get those yields. Genome editing, for example. Because if we're not going to apply more pests or chemicals, for example, agrochemistry, one solution is to genome edit those parts of the crop or animal in order to make them more, actually more resistant and resilient to those changes in the future. So it comes back to what I said earlier. I think we will have an increasing number of options ahead of us, but we've all got to think about which options are we going to pursue in order to reach those goals. Of course, in developing countries like Africa, there's still a lot of gains we can make to get those yields up without even, any of those issues coming in pure agronomy, best practice, and applying what we know about food production to those areas.
And surely that would help answer that question about 122 million people as
There's
well.
a huge impact we can do on that.
And GM's come up for the first time, which I'm surprised at this stage in the talk. But Steve, can you answer, maybe that's much more for less, but this lady's question about how we can fit these things together with health concerns,
Health concerns, and you mentioned how we can influence shareholder value. That's which
I just see conflicting priorities.
Yeah.
Okay. I think I can answer on the shareholder value quite simply, in that we occasionally help out on something called the business benchmark for animal welfare, and that's a benchmark of what industry does, food companies do, for animal welfare, and it's not targeted at the general consumer, it's targeted directly at investors. And the whole of the marketing is towards investors. And so all those companies are analysed in a lot of detail, they get a score, they get told whether they're good, bad or ugly. And then investors can actually pick up that information and use it, because it's trying to get investors to realise that there's a material risk in poor animal welfare or other elements of sustainability. This one is particularly aimed at animal welfare. So it is possible to look at these things in a way which will influence shareholder value. And we know it has an effect because the companies who do well get very involved with it. Some companies do badly, and companies actually want to do better. So we can see the companies are involved with it. That could be expanded to health, it could be expanded to other things.
We're in danger of going over, so we're going to finish with the eco-labels question, because I think that really sums it up in a way, because we all want to, I think we all want to be part of the food production system and encourage better behaviour. So I'd like to perhaps, David, to start on, how can eco-labels, how can people be guided towards the right choices?
I will do that, but I am going to have 20 seconds on the other side. In response to Andrew's thing, the danger of doing more with less is you end up with more and more intensification, which means you get more and more costs borne by society through things like antibiotic resistance and greater concentration of environmental costs and these sort of things. So it isn't just as simple as the price signal of doing more with less leads to better results, because someone will end up paying the price for that. So I wanted to say that. I also wanted to make a point on the technological innovation thing, which is, it reminds me a little bit of talking about geoengineering, and should we put sulfur particles into space in order to reflect the way the sun's rays? Well, we know what we need to do already, we just stop burning so much fossil fuels. Well, there's a similar thing going on here, and I think long before we talk about radical innovations, we know what we need to do, which is to come up with ways to persuade people to eat less meat, because that is by far and away, or better meat. Not you don't give it up, but less quality meat. So, reaching for technology is a bit like this gentleman's point earlier, may not always be the right thing to do. Eco-labelling, the only thing I really wanted to say on that is it's great, it's certainly part of it, but look how complex it is. What are you going to label? You're going to label all of the carbon, all the water use, all the land use, all the resources that have gone in. What about the antibiotics that are in there? What about these things? There's a role for it, but actually, why should you have to label these things? Why should consumers have to navigate this colossal, complicated world? Why is it possible for those costs not to be borne by somewhere else in the system, as opposed to just being hidden and obscure and so complicated? And I think actually, if we can crack that, then we have much less need for that sort of idea.
Do any of the other panelists have a point? Because I think eco-labels really get to the heart of it. Steve,
yes.
you mentioned the...
I'm going to disagree on the eco-labelling.
Right.
I think eco-labelling is great. It needs to be simple, it needs to be straightforward and understood. And I think thinking the ideas of life cycle assessment into eco-labelling is brilliant. I think it works in two ways, because it also acts as a signal to businesses as to what they can do differently. So if they put an eco-label on which says A is better than B, and people then buy more of A, we can actually encourage consumers and encourage business to feed into what consumers want. I wouldn't worry too much about making it too complicated, in that what we've been looking at recently, just been over in Germany, and there's a lovely little app that scans barcodes in shops and provides information on the product, just as you scan it with your little mobile phone. That kind of thing takes a bit of an effort to develop, but once it's there, it's easy, it's usable, it's dead simple. So I think the eco-labelling can come very, very quickly, very easily. It just needs an NGO to take it forward.
I think that sounds excellent. We're going to have to end it there because we've run out of time. And would you like to make a point about eco-labels?
Yes, you are. Well, look, eco-labels, I think, work well if they're simple. But what we've just talked about throughout this evening has been a very complex subject. And I'm not sure that sustainability will be captured with a single label. I think that much more important is to have a conversation about food, as we've been having this evening. Because I think the more people that talk about food, where it comes from, what the choices are that are made about it, the more informed those consumers are, and the better the consumption patterns we have as a result of it. I don't think it can be sorted by a label, much as I'd love it if it could be, and I suspect many people would be. And there's lots and lots of people outside this room that don't give a stuff where their food comes from, they just want to have a nice evening. Or they might even not be able to afford the food that they buy or are offered. So I think there's a lot of, there's quite a luxurious conversation we're having about these sort of topics.
Yeah, of course. I was going to say something similar, just to round up on the eco-label theme. We all would like labels to tell us exactly what to eat, but I think that's a little bit too much to ask. I mean, there's some great ideas with the barcode, and that might give us advice, but the most important thing is to have more knowledge. And I've been really struck by the audience's questions and how they're brought up. Lots of solutions, like the buying British as part of encouraging Brexit, but also what Angela talked about, like some risky research. I only got GM in at the last minute, but I think there's lots of other, the gentleman mentioned there, using seawater and participatory research as well. Using barcode eco-labels and sugar tax, getting government to act. So thanks very much to everyone for coming. Really carry on the conversation, because I'm sure that's how we can really improve the food system. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Louise. Well, just before we break up, I've got three things to say. Let's see if I can remember those three things. Firstly, obviously, to join me and thanking Louise and our wonderful panel for all their answering your questions and providing questions. Number two is for the ecotarians to stand up. And to organise such a wonderful event. You can follow the ecotarians on there. You've got information in front of you. You can follow them on Twitter, _ecotarian, and their website. Local initiatives, seasonal recipes, global issues. Very important. And you can also fill out their postcard form. You can do that. There's some instructions on one side. You fill out on the other side. And you can take this with you. This is point number 3 for our drinks that we're going to have afterwards. Now, very importantly, do not exit the lecture theatre at the top of the stairs, because there's another drinks party going on there. That's not our one. Right? It'll be dead fashion. Come downstairs, go past the grand piano, and then turn left and go follow that way, and that's our drinks party. There's a board to pin your ecotarian ideas up, and we will see those later. So listen, thank you ever so much for coming. I hope you've enjoyed this evening.